I'd like to thank everybody for um, attending this evening for our lecture with Dr. Eric Gonzaba, Mapping the Gay Guides, Understanding Queer Spaces in Pre- and Post-Stonewall America. Dr. Gonzaba will answer questions after the lecture, so please leave your questions in the chat and we will have time at the end for that. So without further ado, Dr. Eric Gonzaba is an assistant professor of American Studies at California State University, Fullerton, where he teaches courses on the history of race and sexuality in America. He received his PhD in American history at George Mason University in 2019. His work has previously been supported by grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Point Foundation, and the Elton John AIDS Foundation. He previously served on the board of the Rainbow History Project, the DMV's premier LGBTQ historical association, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Gonzaba.
Thank you so much, Jim. Good evening, everyone. Happy Pride. As you can see, we're in Oz. This is mostly a background to hide the fact that my living room / office space is completely not cleaned up. So welcome to Oz. Thank you everyone for coming out on a Thursday evening to get to hear me talk a little bit about queer history during Pride Month. I know there are plenty of other things you all could be doing to celebrate Pride Month, so it really means a lot that you logged on for a little bit to hear this talk. And a shout out and mostly apologies to my mother, who I believe is watching, as she's probably horrified to learn that I decided to go blonde for the summer. Whoops, right? It is a real honor to be with you all today and to get to speak here on behalf of the Alexandria History Museum and the other folks here. I want to start off by thanking everyone for this invitation today and for all those who made this possible, especially Jim Holloway for that really nice introduction, and Daniel Lee. It is also a real pleasure to be virtually back almost home, right? Near where I spent a good chunk of my life in Northern Virginia. I was lucky enough to go to graduate school at George Mason University for both my MA and my PhD. In history, and I really got to fall in love with the area. And so although I couldn't be there in person today, I'm so very excited to be connected with all the incredible work being done by historians and the history-loving public of Northern Virginia. So thank you again for having me. Now, as Jim just mentioned, my name is Eric Gonzaba, and I am super lucky to get to spend the next hour with you today to talk about a project that I co-lead with Dr. Amanda Reagan, who's heading to Clemson University, which we call Mapping the Gay Guides. And I'll start off our short presentation today talking about the historical significance and the background content that gave rise to our project, and then and I'm going to spend the last 20 minutes or so taking questions from the audience. And I will say from the outset, I am somebody who thoroughly enjoys answering questions. So do not hesitate at all to ask any or all questions that you have throughout any part of the presentation in the chat. I will be sure to get to them, or as many as I can at the end. So some of you already know, I entitled this talk today, Mapping the Gay Guides, Understanding Queer Spaces in Pre- and Post-Stonewall America. And you know, there's a lot to unpack there in that lecture title. What the heck are gay guides? What does it mean when I talk about queer space? And perhaps to some or some of us here, what exactly is Stonewall and why does it matter? All great questions to think about this Pride Month, and I hope to answer at least some of them, if not all of them today. But to start my talk off, I want to talk about three men who, by all accounts, shouldn't be mentioned in a talk about gays or queer history. Three men who ostensibly weren't gay themselves and likely didn't have a huge clout of gay supporters. As we just finished an election year, and because Alexandria sits in the shadow of the national capital and at the heart of the DMV, let's take a look at three presidents in the middle of the 20th century to see if we can learn something about the rise of gay culture and later the rise of what I call the gay guides. Now, so to begin my talk, I want to invite you all to join me in my time-traveling DeLorean from Back to the Future. Yes, that is a 35-year-old movie reference, so the younger folks on this call are not going to understand this. But let's get in our time-traveling device and head to three cities in three different decades. Our first stop will be the nation's capital during the 1950s. We'll then head south to the Big Peach of Atlanta in the 1960s, and finally back up north to Philadelphia, one of my favorite cities in the country, during the 1970s, just near the famous landmarks like the Liberty Bell and the Four Seasons Total Landscaping. So let's first head to Washington, D.C. And the year is 1957. And the Oval Office is occupied by a stern President Dwight Eisenhower. And in 1957, his administration is dealing with a host of challenges, including pushing through his Middle East foreign policy plan, protecting African-American students at Little Rock Central High School, and keeping an eye on the supposed threat of communist infiltration of the federal government. And yet, likely unbeknownst to Ike, just yards away from his presidential bedroom, he could have likely looked out at the White House windows that overlooked Lafayette Park and not realized that within those thick bushes and overgrown trees were likely a few, if not dozens, of gay men gathering to find companions and sex. Lafayette Park, after all, was one of the most popular cruising grounds for homosexuals in the 1950s. But such outdoor activity was quite risky, as police had long targeted gay men at public and, yes, sometimes private sites for decades. After all, homosexual sex or sodomy was illegal in most states in 1957. Heck, even cities like Washington, D.C. banned same-sex dancing into the 1970s. And to give you an example of just how bad arrests were in Lafayette Park, just outside the White House, in the early 1950s, police arrested over 1,000 gay citizens every year in Washington, D.C. And a sizable chunk of those arrests came on the backs of gay men looking for companions at Lafayette Park. Now, one man arrested at this park and deemed a, quote, sex pervert in 1957 was the person you actually see on the right side of your screen. A perhaps overly opinionated yet compassionate New Yorker who had served his country in Europe during the Second World War, and in the 1950s came to be employed by the federal government at the United States Army Map Service. And his arrest at Lafayette Park contributed to his firing at his government job, as the Dwight Eisenhower administration had a strict policy of not employing openly homosexual people in their ranks. Now, for as depressing as that story is, that man's dismissal would light a spark in him, and Frank Kameny, that man's name, would go on to be one of the most consequential leaders in the homophile and later LGBTQ rights movement. 52 years later, after his arrest, Frank Kameny would stand by side, a later American president and receive a pen that marked a memorandum that banned LGBTQ discrimination in federal employment. Once again, standing just 100 yards from a site of a so-called sex pervert's arrest. Now let's keep that story in our mind, and let's leave the 1950s and the 2000s, I guess, right, the Obama era, and head to the early 1960s. In the midst of his presidential re-election campaign in 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson comes to a prominent Atlanta hotel, the Dinkler Plaza, to give a speech in one of the hotel's ballrooms. Now, in that speech, LBJ famously proclaims, "The New South is here." And the speech definitely had political importance, especially for the leader of a party hoping to consolidate its Southern base, all while trickily supporting African-American civil rights. But it's unclear whether that sort of politics was on the minds of men and women having cocktails and beer and wine and hors d'oeuvres at the hotel's fancy Alibi Lounge. Like Eisenhower, LBJ was probably not aware that just a few rooms over from when he was giving this very, very famous speech, gay men were likely gathering at the Alibi, known in queer travel guides at the time as a place for Atlanta's gay men to meet with one another. That's right, smack dab in the middle of a popular Southern hotel was a queer bar space, unknown by straights, that was frequented by what they would call, what straight people would call at the time, deviant homosexuals. Just feet away where LBJ was proclaiming a new South, gays at the Alibi Lounge and in other spaces around Georgia were slowly but bravely building and sustaining a new gay South. All right, finally, we head north to one of my favorite cities in Philadelphia. The year is 1976, and President Ford is trying his best to rid his party, the Republican Party, of the stain of Watergate. Following his October debate with the Georgian governor, Jimmy Carter, in Center City, President Ford's motorcade took an unexpected right turn onto Spruce Street. Likely unbeknownst to President Ford, as you can see here, we have a pattern, right? There's a pattern of presidents being unaware that they're constantly in the midst of homosexuals, right? The motorcade was driving straight to the heart of the emerging neighborhood of Philadelphia, where gay bars and gay restaurants, gay bookstores, and bathhouses sat. Spruce Street was also the most popular gay cruising street in the city, a part of which was locally referred to by gay men in Philadelphia as the merry-go-round, because cars would constantly circle around this one block, and so would men, right, gay men looking for companions and sex. Gays and lesbians were a bit taken aback when the president was so freely waving at male couples who were holding hands and at gays seated on the steps in front of houses on the mythical merry-go-round. According to the press, one self-identified quote, Spruce Street Queen spun around when the president's limo drove past, and this person waved at the 38th president and asked him, "Did you give it to him, Prez?" Talking about the debate, right? Ford, who was ever so gracious, just smiled and waved. Now, all three of these presidential run-ins speak to the emerging gay landscape of the mid-20th century. Following decades of horrific homophobic discrimination and abuse, gays and lesbians across the United States began moving from their hometowns to larger cities and coastal meccas, and began creating the first real neighborhoods or gayborhoods and spaces that catered to their interests, and that they hoped could form a protective barrier from them and the hostile straight world they were so used to. All across the United States, from the Castro District in San Francisco to Montgomery, Alabama, gays and lesbians began making and remaking spaces to find one another for friendship, for camaraderie, for safety, romance, and sex. But these emerging spaces weren't even across the country. That is, how open a bar or restaurant could be known as a gay space differed depending on where one lived and where one was visiting. How could gays and lesbians navigate and find one another in such a topsy-turvy country? One way me and my project partner, Dr. Amanda Reagan, argued they did this was using gay travel guides, basically lists of spaces that helped gays and lesbians beginning in the middle of the 20th century, try to find these sites, these collective safe spaces. And these are similar to the African-American Green Books. There was a Hollywood movie that came out recently about the Green Books, right? And the Green Books were books that helped African-Americans in the middle of the Jim Crow era find safe locations when they're traveling on long journeys, right? Places where they knew they wouldn't be harassed by hostile and racist whites. Now, to give you some example of these listings, here are some of the listings found in the gay guides of sites that we just talked about. The Dinkler Plaza Hotel, Lafayette Park outside the White House, and of course, Spruce Street, or as the gays came to call it, the merry-go-round. P.S. Gay men, like lots of marginalized community, constantly rename spaces to kind of more familiarize those spaces with their own communities. Like in Philadelphia, where the merry-go-round sits, the Schuylkill River Park was affectionately known as Judy Garland Park, right? A popular hangout and cruising site for gay men in the 1970s through the 1990s. Now, there were and are numerous different sorts of gay travel guides that began in the 1950s, but by far the most famous and prolific of them are the guidebooks we use in the Mapping the Gay Guides project, which I'll just talk about in a couple of minutes. And these guides were called the Dameron Address Books. Now, the Dameron Address Books contain lists that were broken down by city and state of lesbian and gay friendly establishments. And they were meant to help those traveling around the country to seek out friendly spaces. Now, Dameron's guides would become an indispensable tool for gay Americans for decades to come. And the reason why we focus on the Dameron guides than other guides is that the Dameron guides are by far the longest running of the sets of gay guides that were being produced. There are many gay guides that were produced in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but the Dameron guides began in 1964, and they continued all the way to 2020, likely this being the final year of the publication because of things like the internet and whatnot. And I can speak more to that in a little bit. Now, just a quick side note here. My team and I have been working on this project for about a couple of years now. And the reason why they're called the Dameron Guides is that they're originally founded by a man named Bob Dameron. And yet, even though we've been working on this project for a couple of years, we've never been actually able to find a picture of Bob Dameron until very recently, just about a couple of weeks ago. We finally found a photo of this elusive Bob Dameron in a newspaper archive. And y'all are the first group that I've got to actually show a picture of too. And I just want to show you because it's kind of great, right? I'm kind of obsessed with this bold mustache and this awesome collar. Just an awesome photograph. So anyways, before I go on, I just want to spend a quick minute noting that these gay travel guides did not come up in a vacuum in the 1950s and 1960s. They were part of a much wider gay and lesbian print culture that were developed by gays and lesbians themselves beginning in the 1950s. Now, gay publishers began disseminating all sorts of publications, from gay newspapers and newsletters, lesbian pulp novels, physique magazines, pornography, and yes, travel guides. Now, these publications were only one of the major ways queer people began to form identities and communities across the country. But the effort was immensely dangerous. Most of this print culture relied on the US Postal Service to deliver their publications to subscribers around the country, and yet federal law and the US Postal Service forbade the distribution of, quote, obscene material, including almost any material that dealt with even the issue of homosexuality. Editors and distributors could, and often did, get sued, got fined, and even jailed for their participation in this gay media environment. Now, I've included on your screen a photograph of Dwight Eisenhower's Postmaster General, Arthur Summerfield, on the top right of your screen, who ordered the US Postal Service to add these cancellation postmarks, as you see on the bottom, to all first-class mail that he deemed obscene, including any literature or letters or photographs that involved gays, or as he called them, perverts. Now, by the way, just as a quick aside, Postmaster Summerfield was kind of a weird dude beyond his homophobia. Other historians have talked about this, especially the historian David Johnson very recently in his new book. One example of Summerfield's quirkiness, in 1959, he pushed the federal government to start transmitting mail through submarine-based Regulus missiles, and the space that was intended for the warhead in these missiles was replaced with over 3,000 letters. And besides one test flight, the idea never really took off. Get it? Took off? Never mind. I'll keep going. Now, thanks to court cases like One versus Olson and later Manuel versus Day in the 1950s and 1960s, led by brave lawyers and plaintiffs, the Supreme Court eventually ruled that the writings or pictures of homosexuals was not automatically obscene, and thus could be sent through the mail. And following these rulings, this new gay print culture flourished across the United States. And the US Postal Service thus became a hugely important communication network for gays and lesbians, especially for queers who lived far away from the coastal gay havens, the coastal gay villages, or from safer urban havens that near themselves, right? The mail was a lifeline for gays who were living in smaller communities like my hometown in Corden, Indiana, or in Tuttle, Idaho. So the Dameron Guides, which have been in print since 1964, make up the main source of our digital project, which I want to describe to you now. And for those who are watching on a computer, which I assume is most of you, I more than give you permission / encourage you to explore the site while I'm talking with you on maybe a separate tab or something. That's good, but that's a very interactive element for me, encouraging you to not listen to me and actually play around with Mapping the Gay Guides. And you can find the site on mappingthegayguides.org. Now, so from this site, the main way we envision this site to be used is by this map feature, and I'll show you this in a second. And the web app of this map layers digitized data from the Dameron Guides. Literally every single listing is now on this map that my team painstakingly created to show change over time. And the app contains a series of filters that allow users to interact with the data from several different points of entry. Including narrowing the data down by city or state, narrowing to display only certain categories of establishments, and visualizing change over time using a date slider. And if this is all technical stuff, we can look at the actual means of the project right now. So to show you all how to use this site, on the bottom of this, the main map feature, the way to get to this is going to mappingthegayguides.org and hitting the map button at the top. On the bottom are dates from 1965 to 1980, which is all the data that we've currently finished compiling. Remember, the dates, the guides go into print all the way to 2020, but right now we only have the dates from 1965 to 1980 complete. We need a little more time to complete that. So each of these years of this date slider corresponds to one guide. So for example, I'm right now on 1965 here on this picture. You're only looking at locations that were listed in the 1965 Dameron Guide. And here, you see that you're looking at all the listings from the 1980 guide if you drag your slider all the way down to the 1980 guide. So that's 785 American locations in the Dameron 1965 guide compared to over 4,460 locations in the 1980 Dameron guide. So just off the top of my head and acting like I didn't do the math before my talk, that is a 468.28% increase in the number of queer listings in these guides in just 15 years, right? Pretty incredible. Now, the other way to use this map is to filter this map via what my team calls amenity features. And these features are from a lettering coding system that the Dameron Guides use to provide more information to the readers about just what these sites contain within them, or the kind of clientele that was inside them. And you can see the lettering system that was included in almost every guide on the right side of your screen. Now, this coding system changes throughout the years, but as you can see on the right side of your screen, this was a typical explanation of listings found in almost every single Dameron address book. You can see that there are breakdowns alongside of age. You have letters that correspond with older or more mature crowd, very young collegiate types. There's also breakdowns among class, pretty elegant, raunchy types, downtown types, business professional culture. And you also have other subcultures that are represented: Western or country type, uniform culture, leather culture, right? You also see the letter B, which is the only racial designation in the amenity features listed by Dameron, at least up until 1980. And this letter B stood for Blacks predominate, or in later guides, Blacks frequent. And for those of you who might be familiar with some of these explanation or these guides, we actually break down every single one of these lettering systems in our methodology section. So if you have some time, you can read about what each one of these means in greater detail on our methodology section. And we'll return to the race element to this in a second. Now, I'm sure all of you have lots of questions that I want to get to. So in the interest of time, I want to talk next about what my researchers on my team have actually found, some of the findings they've discovered while working on this project, and just kind of offer some hypotheses about how else we might be able to use the project to learn more about a queer history of the United States. Now, to be sure, while doing this project with my partner, Dr. Amanda Reagan, we first sat down to kind of figure out the parameters of mapping the gay guides. We had lots of interest in figuring out whether or not looking at these guides on a macro level, seeing them on a map, viewing the data from a step back, might tell us something more about the social or cultural history of queer people in the middle of the 20th century United States. And despite us only being in the very early stages of our project, we do think we see some major benefits to looking at the gay world using these helpful, but not always reliable sources. And these are not perfect sources, and I can describe why they're not perfect in a second. But I say not always reliable because using the Dameron address books, we have to acknowledge that they're imperfect, right? The most glaring evidence of this is Bob Dameron himself. Dameron hailed, at least at the time of his original publication in 1964, from San Francisco, California, and was a white man. It could probably be expected that at least in the early iterations of the Dameron address books, and likely even in later guides, he would focus on the experiences and the sights of white gay men like Dameron himself. After all, most of the entities in the early guidebooks Dameron published were sites that Dameron himself, had actually personally visited, right? But still, these sources give us a window, albeit imperfect window, to sites sometimes ignored by the mainstream public. Can they tell us perhaps of a more vibrant queer culture outside the major queer meccas of New York and San Francisco? Well, let's start with some of our early spatial findings, which we'll admit are still very rudimentary. Right now, our team is still doing cleaning on our data set, and most of our analysis has really been on the quantitative basis. But spatially, we do have some interesting findings we'd love to share with you. Here are maps comparing the total number of listings from 1965 and 1980, the darker the dot being the more sites located in that location. Now, the names of cities means that they are in the top 10 locations in terms of raw number in that given year, as they are using Dameron's classification for city, which means Manhattan does not include bars in Brooklyn, right? But still, 15 years after the first publication, you see a real growth in spaces in the Midwest, in the South, which is kind of interesting, right? We wouldn't be able to produce maps like this and understand Dameron's guides from a macro level unless we broke down the data in this project. Now, one amenity feature that really interested our team was the letter M, denoting establishments that were, quote, mixed and or tourist, beginning in 1965. Now, throughout the early 1970s, Dameron slightly changed the explanation to mixed crowds and eventually to mixed, some straights, by the late 1970s. Now, this designation largely marked establishments that had a significant, if not majority, number of straight identified patrons or persons who did not identify as gay. And Dameron likely used this designation of M to mark sites where gays and lesbians faced less hostility than in otherwise straight venues. Gay visitors to Florence, Alabama's Pit Grill, for example, in 1980, which stayed open late for those enjoying an evening out, likely didn't find scores of gay men dancing to jukebox music and waving rainbow flags. Rather, the site's designation as M likely denoted that gays would face less harassment than at other such late-night restaurants or bars, for whatever reason. Now, our team is immensely curious about whether this mixed label is a more common designation in places like the Midwest or the South than in other parts of the United States. Long stereotyped as an overly religious, moralistic, and ignorant, these regions of the country are largely perceived by citizens as being especially homophobic and inhospitable to queer life. And this characterization is not necessarily unwarranted, right? Mississippi voters approved a state constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage by a whopping 86% in the early years of the 21st century, right? 11 years later, just before the Supreme Court marriage equality decision in 2015, Pew polling found Southern support for same-sex marriage at 44%, the lowest of any region in the country. And as you can see from the map provided here, we see mixed locations really start helping provide greater representation of the queer culture that we weren't able to capture in early iterations of the guides, right? So this M label is super, super important, especially for areas that we don't consider as gay meccas, right? San Francisco, New York. Now, I want to turn just briefly to some interesting findings on race and racism that my team have been working through via this project. Our team wanted to know that if we can learn something about race and the making of queer communities in the middle of 20th centuries, but using the Dameron address books to understand the racial atmosphere of the United States has proven difficult. For one, at least in the periods covered so far, Dameron, like many people of his day, largely understood race in a kind of a black-white binary, right? Among the many letter-based amenities that Dameron used to classify listings, the only explicitly racial designation he used is the letter B. He does mention Latinos and Latino culture in the descriptions, but he doesn't offer an amenity. And I will say, in the later iterations of the guides, post-1980, he does start listing places for Asian Americans, Latino Americans, things like that. Now, Dameron first used the letter B to denote listings where Blacks predominate in his 1970 publication, the only new listing classification for that year. And the classification changes slightly in 1972, denoting instead Blacks frequent, an explanation for B that will be used for the rest of the 1970s and in the 1980 guide as well. Now, Dameron had left us no methodological information about how the books designated these listings, right? So it's not entirely clear what purpose this information, why including a B, actually served, right? The publisher likely listed a bar as B for the benefit of African-American gay men who sought to find spaces that they could be in the company of other African-American queer people. Additionally, it's possible that Dameron aimed the classification at white men looking to find African-American companions, a sort of fetishization of Black bodies, right? It might have also served to warn perhaps racist white gay men not to attend bars for the very reason that Black men would be in attendance, right? Whatever the reason, the use of these designations allows us to explore some elements of places that cater to Black gay life. Now, one way our project is able to make sense of wider attitudes toward Black gay Americans is to look at our data at a macro level and to pay attention to trends. For example, one facet of Dameron's classification system of relevant concerns, Dameron's use of safety, right? So he constantly, these guides tend to help people, especially gay men, find places of safety, making sure they're not going into a place that, you know, police frequent and whatnot. Now, the most common amenity feature used to denote places that were unsafe was the label RT. You can see it here under the Waldorf in the LA metro area. And this RT label began showing up in the Dameron Guides in 1972 to designate what Dameron calls raunchy types. And he later elaborates here, it's downtown type of places, often hustlers, right? Now, RT was likely Dameron's early attempt to highlight establishments that the guide's primary readership would deem, you know, less than reputable. And the Dameron Guides link sex workers, aka hustlers, and quote unquote downtown types, likely people who live in the inner city, right, to places of vice and crime and deviancy. Now, here's an interesting statistic that we were able to look at now that we have all this data from these 15 years on this platform here. Of the 34,000 listings that we currently have on this site over 15 years, right? only 4% of those 34,000 have a listing of RT, right? Which suggests there only about 4% are, in Dameron's eyes, quote unquote, raunchy, right? But listen to this, ready for this? Of all the Black listings in the data, right? Of all the listings that Bob Dameron lists as with a B label, almost half of them, 47, 48% of them, include the RT label, right? So the Dameron address books, whether intentionally or not, seem to promote the idea that Black spaces were often places of lewd and dangerous conduct. And here we get, I think, is a pretty classic display of racial formation, of subtly defining race through these gay guides, right? Suggesting here that Black gay spaces were going to be places of not found, not for safety for white gay Americans. Now, I would be remiss if I gave a talk with Virginia historians and history lovers without actually talking about the Commonwealth of Virginia and how my project might help understand queer history of Virginia, right? Now, as you can see here, the Dameron Guides don't give us a whole lot of listings from Virginia in any year, which is kind of depressing, right? Pointing perhaps again to Dameron's bias towards major US cities and less of an interest or focus on places like the South, right? As you can see by exploring this site on your screen, Dameron included just 5 Virginia places in his first edition in 1965. Those sites were in Norfolk and Richmond, Roanoke, and Virginia Beach. Sadly, no Alexandria, right? By the mid-1970s, Richmond and Norfolk dominate the Virginia listings, with the state number of Dameron listings going to 36 by the 1980 guide, but still 36 in 1980 is just not a lot for the whole state, right? Especially with active gay culture in Virginia Beach and Richmond and even Alexandria and Arlington, right? So there's something weird going on here. There's not a lot of listings that Dameron lists. So what can we learn about Virginian gay culture by looking at these guides? Well, I contend a few things. First, I contend that these guides provide us starting points to understanding a broader queer history that is often discussed in our media or in our textbooks, right? Take Norfolk, Virginia, for example. Now, Dameron lists in his 1978 guide that the Continental stood at 111 West Haswell Street, a popular spot for dancing and, which was rare for the listings in those guides, a spot where African-American queer people felt comfortable in attending. Not surprisingly, as you just learned, right, the Continental also got an RT rating, right? Again, we have, this is a perfect example here, a place that is listed as Black predominates and as a raunchy space, right? A less than reputable space. Now, for some viewers out there who may know the Continental, the club used to be a world famous jazz club in the 1950s, but as jazz's popularity seemed to wane in the later decades of the 20th century, and as deindustrialization took hold in Virginia, the club changed its motifs and became a popular gay club beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s. And a fun fact here, the Continental is actually a very rare listing in our data because it exists in every single year that we currently have available from 1965 to 1980. That's super rare. The only thing rarer than that, we call what my team calls forever listings, are listings that show up in every single one of the 15 years and are still are still around today. The first forever listing we found was Paramount Steakhouse, Annie's in Washington, D.C., if some of you may have been to, that exists in all of the data in our guides and still exists today. And again, that doesn't seem like, they may not surprise you, they may not be like shocking to you, but it's really important to know that like bars and clubs and gay businesses were fleeting in this era here. They often opened and closed within a few months and weeks. So for an establishment to survive for more than a couple of years, much less a decade or 2 decades, was pretty extraordinary, right? Now, anyways, in so much that we define the beginnings of the gay rights struggle to center around the police violence and the brave fighting back by queer activists in New York Stonewall in 1969, Virginia too had its version of Stonewall riots and Stonewall-like police raids. The police raided Norfolk's Continental Club in March of 1978 and arrested 7 men for, quote, the purpose of lewdness, prostitution, and, quote, not even illicit sexual intercourse. And police records show that these men's crime were, and I'm reading directly from the police report, their crime was holding hands, hugging, and kissing, right? No sexual intercourse here, but sodomy and same-sex interaction, even into the 1970s, is criminalized in many cities across the country, including in Norfolk. A judge eventually dismisses the charges for 5 of the defendants. The last 2, however, had to pay a very small fine, but did spend up to 20 days in the local Norfolk jail. Now, other Virginia listings tell us how these guides help gay men navigate through a world of danger, especially regarding police constantly seeking to crack down on so-called immoral homosexual activity. Now, as you can see on the screen here, Dameron occasionally had wrong information in some of his listing in the guides. For example, quite a few times he said that the Iwo Jima Memorial was in Alexandria, which if I remember correctly, living there, I believe is in Arlington, right? And why was the Iwo Jima Memorial even in the gay guides, right? Well, since the 1950s, like Lafayette Park, gay men living or traveling to Washington, D.C.'s metro area used the wooded area around the memorial to congregate, to find friends and sexual partners. And the site was so popular that even the straight press caught wind of the site, with the Washington Post noting in 1978 that the memorial at night had become, quote, an international haven for homosexual sex. Now, beginning in the early 1970s and continuing throughout the decade, police launched crackdowns at the memorial and the surrounding wooded areas, often with undercover cops. In 1975, for example, police would arrest 103 men in less than 60 days. And police weren't the only danger for cruisers and other gay men at the Iwo Jima Memorial at night. Cruisers in and around the nation's capital faced physical and sometimes deadly violence at popular cruising sites, and police charged several Marine Corps servicemen for beating and muggings of gay men at the Iwo Jima Memorial in the late 70s and the early 80s. However, some of these beatings and muggings by straight people, these charges were dropped because many gay defendants refused to come to court because they feared about being outed, right? They showed up in person. Now, a sign of this danger can be found in the Dameron Guides themselves. In the late 1970s listings of the memorial, for example, the Dameron Guides warn that while the wooded areas around the Iwo Jima might be okay to visit during the day, trying to congregate now was, quote, sure suicide, with murders, muggings, and arrest galore. Now, lest you think that queer folks just, took this violence and police harassment in stride, you would be incorrect, right? Certainly there was some response, especially in the post-Stonewall world. You would do well to know that gays and lesbians did organize a response, and in some ways their collective response was a testament to the political and cultural organization of post-Stonewall America. An active print culture, helped in part by these gay travel guides, along with political organizing popping up in major and even smaller US cities, even beginning in the early 1970s, helped usher in a much more visible and confrontational response to homophobia in cities across the country. Giving you one example here, in responding to the rising arrest of over 60 gay men in late 1971, outside of the Iwo Jima Memorial, gays affiliated with the Gay Activists Alliance, or the GAA, would organize a march with torches and signs to the Iwo Jima Memorial. And many gay activists explained that the police were targeting of gay men at the memorial was unjust. They charged that undercover police, often these gay activists said, the most attractive and muscly cops on the city's police force, were purposely entrapping and soliciting men while hanging out at the memorial or arresting men for their mere presence in or near the park. At this particular protest on January 5th, 1972, these pictures on your screen come to that protest, 20 GAA members rallied on North Meade Street in Arlington and headed toward the park, holding signs with slogans, my favorite one being, "Don't expose yourself, you may be impersonating an officer." Now, if the hundreds of gay men that were already entrapped and arrested wasn't already enough for the park police would eventually go on to arrest 6 marchers at this protest that evening for the crime of, quote, demonstrating without a license. So Dameron's right? There was, quote, arrest galore at Iwo Jima. Okay, so I talked a bit about Norfolk, a bit about Arlington. What about Alexandria, right? Does the absence of listings in the gay guide suggest Alexandria doesn't have a true, queer history? Or am I just being a terrible presenter and not, playing to my crowd? Well, the real answer is, of course, Alexandria has a rich queer history. But there are probably a few answers to why we don't see lots of Alexandria sites listed. For one, it's likely part of Dameron's bias, right? Preferring to focus on sites in major metropolitan areas and perhaps missing the sites that were surrounding the gay haven that is and was Washington, D.C. But still, that's not a very satisfactory answer. Well, for us, right? Well, there is some hope for us, and there's some hope for Alexandra's role in mapping the gay guides. Right now, our team has only been able to offer users the complete US data from the Dameron Guides from 65 to 80. But thanks to a very recent support for the National Endowment for Humanities, our team just received a 3-year grant to expand this listings to the year 2005. And that means another 25 years of Dameron listings that we'll be able to add to this site in the next 3 years. And hopefully when this new data is added in the next 3 years, you'll start to see much more modern representation of Alexandria queer landmarks. Bars and clubs like the French Quarter Cafe, the Hunt Club, the Metropolis, or She Bar, right? So as I close, and before I take your questions, I want to stress real quick to you that my team working on this project likes to think of mapping the gay guides as the start, and we really do stress that, as the start to many new projects into the queer past, hoping to inspire others to think about how local culture, local queer culture can be found in spaces they don't often think about as historically queer, right? Mapping the Gay Guide strives to use a digitized but previously underutilized source space to help map gay life in the United States and challenge ingrained assumptions while also raising new questions about the ways that gay Americans negotiate space in the 20th century. And we hope that our visualizations showcase the expansive nature of gay life in the US and allow us to ask new questions about identity like religion, class, race, and gender by analyzing Dameron's categorizations of gay establishments. And we look forward to adding newer versions of the guides past 1980, thanks to the NEH, to track new developments of gay sites during momentous times in both queer and American history. For example, what happened to the gay neighborhoods and gay culture and gay sites during the AIDS crisis, or what happens to these gay maps when homosexuality is legalized across the country in 2008 because of the Lawrence versus Texas decision at the Supreme Court. So it's been an honor to introduce you to Mapping the Gay Guides, and I look forward to answering your questions. And with that, I'll open up to the floor.
Well, thank you very much. That was outstanding. And we do have a question in the chat, and I invite everyone to add questions as we go. First question is, did later guides before the internet use other sources besides Dameron? And do we know any other contributors?
That's a great question for you. So we're kind of early on this. I'll start by saying, Dameron, like I talked about earlier, really started this off as kind of a project that he himself started, right? So he started listing places, and he actually began really not thinking about this as a commercial project. He occasionally just started writing down places that he felt safe at during his many travels. He was a businessman, right? And what happened is, many people, because they knew that Dameron was, keeping lists of spaces when he was traveling, they would ask him, can I borrow your lists? Can I Xerox your list and, use it? And he had no problem, Xeroxing and sending to his friends. But eventually friends of friends started asking for these lists, and he was like getting tired of Xeroxing these copies. And so I think he was like, I can make a buck for this, right? So I can charge 50 cents for, a Xerox page or something of DC or New York or whatever. And he was like, if this is really in demand, maybe I should actually, make a lot more money by putting them together. So yes, they all started together by like his understanding of listings. Later on, when he couldn't travel to 3,000 sites, he started making calls to contacts that he had. And these contacts would say, oh yes, there's a bar on this street here, or there's a bar on this street. And that's how he started keeping tabs. But again, these are imperfect source spaces, right? Because what one person's memory or one person's idea of what the gay world looks like does not encompass everyone's view of the gay world, right? The bars that gay men were going to were not the bars that lesbians were going to. But to your question, before the internet, eventually there is much more interaction between the Dameron team. Dameron eventually sells his publication to another person, and they kind of take it over, and they start a kind of assistant, still doing the same thing, where they solicit bar owners to help them find more and more spaces. And that's how it kind of goes. It's kind of a word of mouth thing. But Dameron's really important. His guides are super important because they are often the ones that other gay travel guides are going to copy. When I say copy, I mean some of them are copying them word by word, right? They don't even try to change the listings or anything like that. And so Dameron's version to me, is the most definitive, and that's why we decided to use Dameron's copy instead of using ones like the Gay Yellow Pages, which were quite famous, or Places of Interest that were also big in the 80s. yeah, but it was kind of a word of mouth thing. And now, even post the internet age, now now it's kind of run online, so users can still have a Dameron account and find listings online. But the Dameron address books are becoming obsolete, right? Anyone can Google local gay spaces that they want to and find establishments much more quickly now. The use of a physical guidebook is becoming almost useless, right?
Thank you. We have another question here. The data visualization and digital presentation are so effective and engaging. Did you have an interest in doing digital history before going to George Mason, or did you go there in part because of their new media, their use
Oh,
of?
thank you. Thank you, Amy. I love that question. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for your kind words about the site. I will say first, my co-partner in crime, who also was a GMU history PhD graduate, so a lot of Northern Virginia rep here and love, is really the kind of the digital heart of this project. Dr. Amanda Reagan she gets all the credit for designing this incredible site. I'm kind of the content manager of it. We decided to divide our work. But to your question about George Mason, I have a funny story about George Mason. I went to George Mason for my master's and my PhD. Following a professor there, I really wanted to work with an incredible professor of history there, Dr. Suzanne Smith, who was kind of a history of African-American culture and whatnot. So I get there and they tell me on day one, as many of you know, we are a digital history hub. You'll be doing digital projects here. And I'm sitting in the audience like, uh-oh, I had no idea this was a digital history hub. I should have learned that before I came. But despite being freaked out, I still took the required courses, and you're required to do digital projects. And I did a project called Wearing Gay History, which got some good feedback to it. So I was like, oh, maybe I could do this. Maybe I can do this. But no, I did not seek out George Mason because of its digital prowess. I kind of fell into it. But it's a testament to getting your feet wet in methodologies that you're not comfortable with. You can actually find yourself thriving in a way that people who are very accustomed to it have trouble with, just because you often come in with new ideas and not understanding everything. So you're constantly in the midst of wanting to learn more. And so I think it's a good advice for anyone out there. If you're worried about starting a new project that is totally on a field that you're not familiar with, just jump in and start it. You'll be surprised what you learn and what can happen with it. So thank you for that question, Amy.
Okay, and I was helping some people in the beginning, so I apologize if I missed this, but could you elaborate a little bit on your personal connection that drew you to this specific project?
That's a great question. So going to George Mason, I never thought I would write a history of. I'm currently working on a book on gay nightlife, which was my dissertation project at George Mason University. So I'm kind of adapting it to that. But this project actually began because of the dissertation project. So when I began my project on nightlife, I found my most important source space, and this is a source space that's so important to queer people in general, queer historians, were oral histories, right? And the reason why oral histories are such a foundational source for gay historians is that so much of queer historical material has been lost, right? Has not been kept for many different reasons, which I can go into. And so, actually listening to the words and hearing people's stories from queer Americans is especially important, especially for any kind of marginalized community. But what I found very quickly was I was having trouble trying to locate spaces, right? I was learning about gay bars. I kept hearing people were telling me about the baths and the cruising grounds they went to, and I was losing track of spaces. Like I was kind of keep a list of places in Baltimore that my three subject studies were Baltimore, Philly, and DC, and I couldn't figure out some people said, oh, this bar was on this street, but another person said it was on another street. And so I was losing track. So I needed something that gave me at least an initial list of some kind of gay spaces that I could confirm addresses and whatnot. And I came across these address books. And I want to say very quickly that these gay guides and the other gay travel guides are not novel sources to us, right? They've been written about by historians before. And so I was kind of just using them in a different way. And the project was good. And I defended my dissertation. And during my dissertation defense, my now co-director of this project, Dr. Amanda Reagan, is in the back, and I'm showing the list of symbols about how each of these bars is divided in one. And she comes up to me at the end. She goes, "I love this. Have you ever thought about thinking about trying to see mapping all this data that you have, these address books?" And I was like, "No, I never thought about that." She goes, "You might be interested. We should just sit down and think about this project." And so we literally sat down on a snowy, very cold Fairfax, Virginia morning, and we just started mapping out just ideas for this project and why we might use it and how people might benefit by looking at this. And we kept being like, when we come to this, we'll have time, we might look at it. And what happens is that we slowly, found ourselves working on it for a couple hours, some weeks, and a couple hours another week. And it turned out we built a prototype of just a couple of years in the US South. And we learned a lot by just looking at those years. We learned that there was a gay religious culture that was taking off in the US South that was not taking off in other parts of the country that we didn't know before. We learned more about mixed spaces by doing this prototype. And we got obsessed with this project. And so we applied for some local funding at when I got my job here at Cal State Fullerton. And then we built a larger prototype of 15 years. And this kind of impressed the NEH, hopefully. And they want to see a much bigger project that expands all the way to the 21st century. So it really started small. It started people just being like, let's really kind of build just a very small prototype. And we kind of built it from there. And we're excited to see where it goes in the next couple of years.
Excellent. Excellent. Dr. Gonzaba, thank you so much for
thank
being
you so
here
much
tonight. It's been a pleasure. And everybody have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Happy Pride.